If you do not know your ancestors built empires, commanded armies, amassed wealth that envied European kings, and ruled with wisdom respected by other civilizations, then you might believe the lie of inherent inferiority. You might accept subjugation as natural. You might not struggle for the power that is your birthright. But resistance is Black history. From Amanirenas defeating Rome to Nzinga battling Portuguese colonizers. From the Kandakes building pyramids to Amina expanding kingdoms. Each generation has combated erasure. Each generation has refused disappearance. Each generation has preserved a fragment of truth and transmitted it forward. Your textbooks deceived. These queens commanded the world before Europe knew that world existed. They wielded wealth, respect, and power rivaling any contemporaries. Remembering them transcends correcting historical inaccuracies. It is understanding that the current global order, where European and European-descended powers dominate, is not natural or inevitable. It is the outcome of specific historical processes, violence, theft, and erasure. It is a construct that can be contested and transformed. Because the most perilous action against a system built on lies is speaking truth. The truth that Africa nurtured civilizations when Europe contained villages. The truth that Black women governed empires with authority that compelled men to bow. The truth that African accomplishment was systematically erased to justify centuries of exploitation. The truth that we inherit the legacy of queens. Recall their names. Narrate their stories. Refuse their forgetfulness anew. They did not fight their wars, build their empires, and rule their kingdoms so their descendants would believe their conquerors' lies. They did it so we would know, so we would remember, so we would understand that greatness is our inheritance, regardless of centuries of propaganda stating otherwise. It was declared unreliable or exaggerated. Because if people knew Africa had queens governing empires while Europe remained largely illiterate, how could you justify the colonial project? If people knew Africans had complex political systems, advanced architecture, and flourishing universities, how could you claim they needed European civilization? The most revolutionary act, it emerges, is recollection. It is refusing the sanitized, whitewashed version of history that renders European dominance seem natural and inevitable. It is unearthing the stories they tried to bury and proclaiming them too loudly to ignore. These 5 queens were not exceptions. They were not rare anomalies on a primitive continent. They were products of sophisticated societies valuing different principles than Europe. Societies where women could hold ultimate power, where martial skill outweighed gender, where wealth and learning prospered long before Europe emerged from its dark ages. Their stories were not lost. They were stolen deliberately, systematically, as part of a centuries-long campaign to make people forget that Black civilizations constructed empires, that Black rulers commanded global respect, that Black people have always been capable of extraordinary achievement when not subjected to systemic oppression and erasure. History is penned by conquerors, true, but the truth persists. It persists in archaeological evidence they could not fully annihilate. It persists in oral traditions passed down through generations despite attempts to silence them. It persists in ancient texts documenting these kingdoms before political motives dictated their denial. It persists in the DNA of every descendant of these civilizations, carrying the legacy of queens and emperors, known or unknown. Erasing a people's past is how you command their future. He was literally too wealthy for his era's economic systems. He constructed libraries, universities, mosques. He transformed Timbuktu into an Islamic intellectual hub, ruling an empire larger than Western Europe. And yes, they found evidence of these 5 queens and many more like them. Women commanding armies while European women could not own property. Women controlling trade routes while European women risked burning as witches for education. Women founding dynasties enduring longer than most European kingdoms. African civilizations did not collapse from primitiveness or inferiority. They were systematically dismantled by the transatlantic slave trade and European colonization. Over 4 centuries, an estimated 12 to 15 million Africans were kidnapped and enslaved. Whole areas were depopulated. Complex political frameworks were deliberately shattered. Economic systems were redirected to serve Europe. Then, after colonizers finished extracting wealth and ruining societies, they gestured at the devastation they caused and declared, "Observe, they were never civilized originally." The evidence of the falsehood is omnipresent if you know where to search. Ancient Greek historians like Herodotus wrote openly of traveling to Africa and learning from African scholars. The Bible brims with references to powerful African kingdoms. Kush repeatedly, Ethiopia throughout. Roman coins exhibit extensive trade with Nubian empires. Medieval Arab scholars penned detailed accounts of visiting West African kingdoms, amazed by their wealth and sophistication. The proof was never truly hidden. It was ignored, dismissed, or reinterpreted to sustain the narrative of African inferiority. By the 1800s, as colonization peaked, this history was actively suppressed. It was classified or buried in archives accessible only to scholars. It was excised from educational programs. It was memory conquest. Because if people know their ancestors forged empires, governed kingdoms, defeated Roman legions, and commanded vast wealth, they will not accept inferior treatment. They will know their subjugation is fraudulent. Thus, records required destruction. The libraries of Timbuktu, holding countless manuscripts of African history, science, and literature, were burned. Gold and artifacts proving African metallurgical sophistication were melted. Stone structures were attributed to anyone but their African builders. The powerful women who ruled were erased or diminished. Their power stripped, their feats minimized. The falsehood they told was simple. Africa had no civilization before Europe. Africans had no history worth instruction. Black people built, invented, ruled nothing. Anything valuable in Africa must have originated externally. This lie justified slavery. How could enslaving people who achieved nothing be wrong? It justified colonization. Europeans were supposedly bestowing civilization upon darkness. It justified theft. Africa's resources belonged to whoever was sophisticated enough to extract them, and Africans supposedly were not. But here is the truth they attempted to inter. When Europeans finally reached West Africa in the 1400s, they discovered cities that astonished them. They found the Mali Empire with a GDP overwhelming medieval Europe's. They discovered Timbuktu with universities older than Oxford, where scholars studied mathematics, astronomy, law, and medicine. They encountered Benin with bronze casting so advanced Europeans could not replicate it and assumed importation. They saw Great Zimbabwe with stonework so sophisticated colonizers spent years insisting Phoenicians or Arabs built it, because accepting African creation was ideologically unthinkable. They learned of Mansa Musa, a black emperor whose Hajj to Mecca distributed so much gold it disrupted the Mediterranean economy for years. They commanded armies, controlled trade routes, minted coinage with their likeness. They corresponded with other rulers as peers. The Bible references a Kandake in Acts, though her authority is often minimized. These were women with absolute power in a world where Greece and Rome insisted only men could govern. Yet their existence has been reduced, footnoted, or erased from common history. Now consider Queen Amina of Zazzau, ruling modern northern Nigeria from approximately 1533 to 1610. Amina assumed power in the Hausa Kingdom when trans-Saharan routes were Africa's commercial highways. Salt, gold, ivory, and captives moved along these paths, enriching their controllers. Amina resolved to command them all. She assumed army leadership and expanded Zazzau's territory through conquest and strategic alliances. She personally led battles, commanding up to 20,000 soldiers. Wherever she conquered, she erected fortified city walls, some still standing today. She reigned 34 years, never marrying to avoid sharing power, rejecting European traders' attempts to establish protective ties that would weaken her authority. Her kingdom became one of West Africa's wealthiest. Her military innovations influenced regional warfare for generations. Yet when British colonizers arrived centuries later and heard her tales, they declared her likely mythical. Africans could not have possessed a queen so potent, successful, militarily brilliant. It must be exaggerated folklore. Disregard the oral histories preserving her story in detail. Disregard the archaeological proof. Disregard other historical sources confirming her existence. The British needed Africans to appear primitive, uncivilized, incapable of self-rule. A queen like Amina contradicted that. So they dismissed her as legend until modern archaeology corrected them. Observe the pattern now. Comprehend what was executed. It surpassed territorial conquest. She used guerrilla combat, scorched earth methods, and hit-and-run strikes that kept Portuguese forces disoriented. For 30 years, she repelled them. 3 decades of conflict where Portugal expended all resources and could not break her. She personally led troops into combat into her 60s. She negotiated and broke treaties, refusing all submission attempts. Dying at 80, she remained undefeated, having liberated thousands and prevented full Portuguese conquest during her life. How did history record her? Portuguese accounts labeled her a witch, a savage, a demon. Unable to admit being stalemated by a black woman, they vilified her instead. For centuries, her story was erased or twisted into propaganda of African barbarity. Only recently have historians acknowledged her reality. One of her era's greatest military and political intellects, waging a desperate war against an enemy seeking to enslave her people. But we must retreat further to discuss a title more than a person. In Kush, the term was Kandake. In Greek, Candace. It meant queen, but not merely a queen. It meant a warrior queen ruling independently, commanding armies, deciding without a king's directive. From roughly 300 BCE to 300 CE, multiple Kandakes ruled Kush, their reputations so formidable that conquerors hesitated. When Alexander the Great swept across the known world, he reached Nubia's border and halted. Ancient sources imply he learned of the Kandakes' martial prowess and deemed the battle not worthwhile. Reflect. Alexander, who conquered from Greece to India, who crushed Persia, deemed great because he seemed unstoppable, examined Nubia and declined. The warrior queens of Kush possessed a renown that gave even Alexander pause. These queens constructed pyramids. Yes, Sudan contains more pyramids than Egypt, a fact obscured as it contradicts narratives of African civilization. Thus Rome, the empire that allegedly never yielded, did the nearly unthinkable. They brokered a peace accord. They exempted Kush from taxes. They withdrew forces and permitted Amanirenas to retain her kingdom's sovereignty. Consider that. A black African queen defeated the Roman Empire, not in fable, but in recorded history. Roman historians documented it. Archaeology verifies it. Yet, who has heard of Amanirenas? Which history courses teach that Rome lost a war to a Nubian queen? Her tale is buried in appendices while Roman triumphs over barbarians fill volumes, because admitting a black woman outmaneuvered Roman generals disrupts the narrative of Western supremacy. Jump forward about 1,600 years to Ndongo in modern Angola. The year is 1624, and the Portuguese have arrived in strength. They're not exploring or trading fairly. They are hunting captives to fuel the transatlantic trade that will ravage Africa for centuries. They have just met someone who will plague them for 30 years. Her name is Nzinga. Nzinga was royal-born, but fought for every shred of respect in a world resolved to deny it. As her brother's envoy meeting the Portuguese governor, they intentionally provided no chair, a power play to force her to stand or sit low. Nzinga refused the insult. She motioned to a servant who knelt on hands and knees. She sat upon the servant's back as a throne. She negotiated the entire treaty from that position, clarifying she would not be diminished. After her brother's suspicious death and her assent, the Portuguese believed they could manipulate or frighten her. They were disastrously mistaken. Nzinga proved a military genius who comprehended something unexpected from an African ruler: European politics. She pitted Portuguese against Dutch. She converted to Christianity when advantageous, then abandoned it when not. She offered refuge to escaped slaves and deserters, building an army of those with reason to despise the Portuguese. Reflect on that duration. Here is where deletion commences. For centuries, European academics insisted the Queen of Sheba was Arab, not African. They could not concede a black woman held the fortune and intellect to challenge Solomon. They distorted geography, disregarded Ethiopian records, and crafted complex theories to deny rightful credit. To acknowledge a black African queen ruled one of antiquity's wealthiest kingdoms, that she was learned enough to contest Solomon's wisdom, that she was potent enough to bargain as an equal, that would undermine everything they needed proclaimed about Africa. Now, advance to approximately 40 BCE. The Roman Empire peaks. Caesar Augustus, its first emperor, expands his domain everywhere. Rome is deemed unconquerable, history's supreme military power. Then they encounter Queen Amanirenas of Kush. Kush, in modern Sudan, also called Nubia, was an ancient civilization predating Rome itself. They had their own pyramids, script, complex culture, and no desire to submit to Rome. When Augustus imposed taxes on Nubia after seizing Egypt, Amanirenas delivered an unexpected reply. She mobilized 30,000 warriors, marched north, and obliterated 3 Roman forts. She didn't just overcome soldiers, she sent a statement. She decapitated statues of Augustus and interred his bronze head beneath temple steps for eternal trampling. That head now resides in the British Museum, its story seldom shared. Homaged. This was not the plan. They dispatched 10,000 legionnaires south to quash the revolt. Then, the extraordinary happened. Amanirenas fought them to a stalemate. For 5 years, this one-eyed queen warrior resisted antiquity's greatest military apparatus. She employed guerrilla strategies, superior landscape knowledge, and tactical genius to make each Roman advance costly. The conflict grew too expensive, too gory, too arduous. This was no oversight. This was a calculated agenda. To enslave millions, to colonize a whole landmass and siphon its riches for ages, you require a narrative to rationalize it. You need global conviction that these people possessed no society, no chronicle, no magnificence. You need universal belief that you are delivering illumination to shadow, refinement to brutality. Thus, the falsehood became syllabus. The falsehood became reality. The falsehood became the sole account most would ever know. Yet the fact endured. In spoken traditions relayed across generations. In excavation sites they failed to fully eliminate. In antique documents penned by Greeks, Romans, and Arabs who actually toured these kingdoms and recorded their splendor. And in the chronicles of 5 queens whose influence was so unequivocal that even ages of deletion could not entirely conceal them. The initial queen we must discuss existed nearly 3 millennia past. Her name was Makeda, perhaps recognized as the Queen of Sheba. She governed a realm stretching across contemporary Ethiopia and Yemen. And she monopolized a commodity of phenomenal riches, frankincense and myrrh. If these terms are only familiar from holiday hymns, understand. In antiquity, these resins surpassed gold in worth. They were utilized in rites, healing, fragrances, and preservation. Controlling the frankincense commerce was akin to controlling modern petroleum. Makeda possessed not merely currency, but the caliber of influence that compelled other leaders to require her. The Bible recounts her visit to King Solomon in Jerusalem. She tested his wisdom with complex queries, bearing gifts of spices, gold, and jewels. The simplified tale excludes this meeting's political nature. This was a diplomatic summit between 2 supreme powers. Solomon required her trade paths. She needed to evaluate a potential alliance. Ethiopian lore states they bore a son, Menelik, founder of an Ethiopian imperial line lasting 3 millennia. While Europe lingered in witch-burning superstition, a black monarch led a force of 120,000 troops and governed commerce corridors valued in the modern billions. Her identity was intentionally purged from her education. She stood among others. 5 African sovereigns constructed realms so formidable that Europe's monarchs pleaded for their wealth, then altered the past to feign their non-existence. This recounts their legacy. We must journey to a distant age, an era when the concept of Europe held little weight, when Rome was in its infancy and Greece was refining democracy. Across those centuries, while Europe was speckled with tribal hamlets, African queens were already directing legions of thousands, erecting structural wonders, and dominating trade networks linking 3 continents. These were no ceremonial symbols adorned with crowns for spectacle. These were battlefield commanders leading from the front, economic strategists who monopolized resources, generating immeasurable royal riches. Architects of societies so progressed that Europeans arriving ages later could not comprehend black people as their creators. Yet this remains absent from your schooling. This is the segment meticulously omitted from every historical text you've encountered. European invaders did not merely subjugate Africa. They launched an assault on African remembrance. They methodically eradicated libraries, torched antique manuscripts, liquefied golden relics, and toppled temples. They reassigned city titles, altered cartography, and upon discovering indestructible archaeological proof, they falsified its origins. They asserted Egyptians were not authentically African. They argued Nubians were essentially Middle Eastern. They observed stone metropolises in Zimbabwe and proclaimed with certainty that Africans could never have engineered such complexity. It had to be outsiders. It had to be anybody else.